We are a little ahead of schedule, but I think that's okay. I see that our next keynote is with us, and that's Nada Culver, who's a Deputy Director for the Bureau of Land Management in their Washington, D.C. office. Nada oversees, she is the Director of Programs and Policy for the Bureau of Land Management. Prior to her role with the BLM, Nada served as the Vice President for Public Lands and was a Senior Policy Counsel at the National Audubon Society. I've had the privilege of getting to know Nada over the years, and we've served together on a few Rocky Mountain mineral panels I can remember fondly. So Nada, it's a delight to have you join us today, and look forward to your remarks. And then also, just for the participants attending the conference, we're going to use the Q&A chat function. So as Nada is speaking, if a question comes to your mind, please drop it in the Q&A chat, and then we'll have an opportunity for some Q&A with Nada at the end of her presentation. So with that, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Temple, and thanks again for the opportunity to talk with all of you today. I'm going to share an overview of some of BLM's initiatives. Because of our broad multiple use and sustained yield mission, we have a lot of initiatives that affect energy law and policy in the Rockies. And so much of that, of course, touches down in particular in Wyoming. Some has already been highlighted today in the previous panels and will make for great ongoing discussions. I've heard Governor Gordon talk a lot about how Wyoming can participate in every aspect of our energy future. And so I think there's a lot to talk about in terms of what one of the previous panelists emphasized about how the state might stay in the game. So if we could look at the next slide. Temple has informed me it's better to have slides to distract you all and give you something to look at. So these slides might not be that exciting, but I hope they're helpful. So starting with climate change, which the president has identified as one of the key challenges of our time, in which so many of his initiatives starting on day one address. There were a number of executive orders issued right in the beginning of the administration, in particular Executive Order 14008, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. And its entire frame was restoring balance on public lands and waters, creating good paying union jobs, and providing a path to align management of our public lands and waters with our nation's climate conservation and clean energy goals. And it provides direction on energy and many other commitments, but it includes getting our electricity sector carbon pollution free by 2050. And the BLM has a really important role to play in all aspects of this. You can see here the secretarial order that followed, 3399, also focused on accelerating renewable energy development and using science in decision making. And the BLM, has a strong record on renewable energy and conservation, as well as energy management backed by our deep knowledge and expertise. Section 207 of Executive Order 14008, in terms of climate, directs us to take actions to enhance siting and permitting for renewable energy. The other aspect I would just highlight from the executive order is the standing up a civilian climate corps, which again will allow us to put a new generation of Americans to work conserving and restoring our public lands. And we're looking forward to doing that. And of course, there's more on the table there in pending legislation in front of Congress, but at BLM, we're starting off working on this on our own. So the next slide. Just want to go into a little more detail on renewable energy. Overall, our goal here is working toward permitting 25 gigawatts on public lands by 2025. In addition to the direction in the executive order that I mentioned, we have very specific, this goal comes also from the Energy Act of 2020, which directed the BLM to create renewable energy coordination offices, set these national goals, and provided us with a mandate to move forward, but also told us to look at how to adjust our rents and fees on public lands to better support renewable energy and make public lands more interesting, for lack of a better term, but more available for development. And we have to do all of these things, responsibly with an equity lens and looking at other resources and concerns. So pretty challenging to address all of that. And some of what we're doing is, we've identified significant portions of public lands with excellent solar and wind energy and geothermal resources, and looking at how we can build off of those. And right now we have 37 solar projects, 36 wind projects permitted on BLM lands, generating 10,200 megawatts, approximately 47 operating geothermal power plants and 1 under construction. And then the power we're talking about right now would power roughly 5 million homes. So a significant contribution. In approving these projects, we work with other federal agencies, tribal governments, local communities, state regulators, industry, and so many stakeholders. There's a lot to do, but this development is crucial in achieving the Biden administration's goals. So we are committed to that. The most recent large-scale approvals we have on BLM lands include the Crimson Solar Project in the California desert. And that as a project on its own would power approximately 87,500 homes. And we're processing a lot of utility scale renewable energy applications, including ones like the Oberon Solar Project and the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, and new transmission such as 10 West Link in Arizona, and the proposed Green Link West and North projects in Nevada. And obviously those aren't the Rockies, but we expect to see similar buildup and interest across the West. Recently, we conducted some listening sessions on regulatory updates and interim guidance that we might issue to, again, support development and permitting of renewable energy on public lands. And these addressed a wide range of issues, including rent schedules and fees for wind and solar, when we would use competitive processes and terms for rights of ways and leases, other ways we might prioritize applications and deal with screening and processing times, and broadly overall other improvements to how we administer the renewable energy and rights of way projects, such as looking at environmental justice. And in our efforts so far, what we have been doing is assessing staffing levels related to the renewable energy program, and developed a proposal to establish the renewable energy coordination offices across the West. We are taking action in the meantime to enhance permitting coordination and looking at interim policy to adjust rental rates and megawatt fees under the authority we now have under the Energy Act of 2020. We've prioritized a short list of key programmatic actions, regulatory updates, and interim policies, and are getting input on more, as you can see from this list, but we're considering issues like updating the solar energy zones contemplated in the solar programmatic environmental impact statement completed in 2012, looking at wind areas and updating the west-wide energy corridors that were designated across the West previously. Next slide. We recently kicked off a review of the coal program and published a notice of intent in the Federal Register, and that published in August. We recently completed, just days ago, the comment period. It ended October 5th, and we've received more than 80,000 comments so far. And this is a new review of the coal program to consider whether the current regulatory framework works and what other better mechanisms we could provide to decide which resources should be made available, how the leasing process might work, including when and where to lease, excuse me. So we'll be moving forward with government-to-government consultation as well on the coal program, talking about how the program itself affects tribes, and to consider the potential environmental, social, and cultural impacts of the program on Indigenous communities and their lands during this review. So our next step will be determining what other analysis we might do and how that might affect the program at large. Next slide. I heard a lot about this on the previous panel, and I know Phil Lowe from the Solicitor's Office provided a lot of update on our litigation, which, as you heard, we have quite a bit of. That includes looking back on leases and policies that is required now due to previous court rulings on issues like climate and wildlife, but also recent court rulings on moving forward with leasing. We have been conducting a review of the onshore and offshore programs as directed by Executive Order 14008, in looking at climate and other impacts, royalties, and other fiscal aspects of the program. We have appealed a preliminary injunction of the pause on leasing that was directed in the executive order. But in the meantime, we are continuing as required by the court order while our appeal is pending. And as I think Phil mentioned, we've posted scoping notices on sales across the West. The scoping period on that just closed on October 1st, and those were drawn from sales that were deferred from Q1 and Q2 of this year. So we will next be looking at environmental review of parcels for potential leasing. And after that, state offices will identify eligible and available parcels and stipulations. And I wanted to take a moment to focus on our work on orphaned oil and gas wells. We define an orphaned well as a well that has no responsible or liable party, doesn't have sufficient bond coverage for plugging and surface reclamation. And then we have a whole group of wells called idled wells that are defined by the Energy Policy Act of 2005 as a well that has been non-operational for at least 7 years and with no anticipated beneficial use. And I just want to highlight these because this affects how the BLM determines wells that will make our various lists of orphaned or idled wells and the actions we're taking right now. Currently, under I think what we would agree are potentially conservative estimates, we've identified about 85 orphaned wells on public lands and over 7,400 idled wells. And we are working hard to prevent the transition of these non-operational wells to orphan well status, which includes annual risk-based inspection and enforcements, monitoring of idled wells, and then if wells become orphaned and present immediate concerns to health and safety and the environment, we prioritize them that way for plugging. So for fiscal year 2022, we've proposed, we have $4.2 million in base funding set aside, and we've requested an additional 8.4 above and beyond that. And as we were all hearing about the many bills in Congress, obviously we could end up with a lot more to do on that. And we look forward to doing that, addressing the risks to health and safety and the climate, and also creating more good paying jobs through addressing orphaned and idle wells. Next slide. Critical minerals have become a very hot topic as they relate to supporting energy development writ large and mining on public lands. And President Biden has made mineral production a priority as part of his whole of government approach, outlined in Executive Order 14017, America's Supply Chain. The executive order was signed in February of 2021 and emphasizes the need for resilient, diverse, and secure supply chains to ensure economic prosperity and national security. That order initiated a 100-day supply chain review, and the results of that review were released on June 8th. It highlighted the need to invest in sustainable domestic production of critical minerals and created 2 new interagency groups that BLM will be engaging with. The first group is tasked with collaborating with the private sector, states, tribal nations, and other stakeholders to determine how to identify where critical minerals could be produced and processed in the United States while adhering to the highest environmental, labor, and sustainability standards. The second group will bring together experts from across the government to identify gaps in statute and regulations that may be needed to be addressed and updated to ensure that any new mining meets strong environmental and consultation standards throughout the entire mining project life cycle, from initial exploration through reclamation, including meaningful engagement and consultation with tribal nations. As many of you know, the current statute governing mining on public lands dates back nearly 150 years. And almost all of the minerals on the 2018 critical mineral list are mined under that law, written at a time when the federal government was trying to encourage development of the West, providing public land and resources at low or no cost. So this means that mining gold or silver, copper, lithium, copper, nickel, rare earth elements, and many others on public land are almost always paying no royalties. Sorry, had a little technical moment there. So they're not paying royalties to the federal government. And while BLM can't single-handedly change the mining law of 1872, we are examining our hard rock regulations as part of this interagency process directed under the executive order. And if necessary, we will update them to ensure that we can meet the highest environmental, labor, and sustainability standards. We're committed to finding an environmentally sound and balanced approach to permit responsible mineral development while also protecting public lands for future generations as acquired by the Federal Land Policy Management. Next slide. Just like to note that it took me 7 slides to get to the greater sage-grouse. So here we are. The greater sage-grouse, of course, especially in Wyoming, interacts with all energy development and other initiatives on public lands, state lands, private lands. Right now, the BLM is focused on continuing our efforts to conserve healthy sagebrush ecosystems on public lands that also serve as key greater sage-grouse habitat and support hundreds of other species. For the BLM, we are currently undertaking a couple of initiatives. The first is to comply with a court order on the issue of the mineral withdrawal, the potential mineral withdrawal, I should say, halted by the last administration. We published a notice that we are restarting evaluation of the proposed withdrawal of public lands in sagebrush focal areas from mineral location and entry. The focal areas comprise about 10 million of the 67 million acres of greater sage-grouse habitat the Bureau manages in 10 Western states. We published the notice and we're starting work on an updated draft environmental impact statement for comment. Also, we will be in the coming month or so beginning an action to evaluate and update the sage-grouse management plans finalized in 2015 and later revised in 2019. Of course, that last revision was enjoined by a court. We will be moving forward to file a public notice, scoping notice in the Federal Register to kick off that comment period for input into a planning effort to address new information on the status of the sage-grouse, such as the declining population counts we've seen, new research, such as a recent USGS study showing that where wild horses exceed recommended management levels, it harms sage-grouse, and we see a decrease in sage-grouse populations. So we'll be moving forward with that in coordination with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Geological Survey, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and the U.S. Forest Service. So we are looking at what other action may be needed to support sagebrush habitat conservation and restoration. Our goal with this effort is to focus on implementation. We need to be moving forward with conserving the greater sage-grouse, and we hope to do this in an efficient manner till we can address the many challenges from climate change, fires, drought, other stressors on the public land, and continue to move forward in a collaborative manner with this management of this species and its habitat. Knowing that the states have been great partners before for the BLM, as the states manage the species and we and our sister agencies manage the habitat, we're looking forward to that continued relationship going forward. Next slide. I wanted to touch on the America the Beautiful initiative, also often referred to as 30 by 30. This effort was launched as a decade-long challenge to pursue a locally led and voluntary nationwide effort to conserve, connect, and restore lands, waters, and wildlife on which we all depend. And the overarching goal is to conserve at least 30% of our lands and waters by 2030, recommended by scientists as the level needed to safeguard our community's health, food supply, biodiversity, and prosperity. A preliminary report was issued by the administration in May of this year, and focused on having this initiative address 3 key issues: nature loss, climate change, and disparities in access to nature. So this is broader than might be used in some of the other international and approaches being used to pursue conservation of 30% of lands and waters by 2030, in that it's looking beyond, looking at conservation and restoration, not just protection and preservation, and also looking at this aspect of access to nature. So a broader focus, but again, focusing on locally led and voluntary efforts that we would want to highlight. The preliminary report, for those who didn't read it, it is available on the Interior website. Because we like lists in the federal government, we have 2 key lists here. We have 8 core principles that will guide this effort, including a collaborative approach, conserving lands and waters for the benefit of all people, supporting locally led and designed efforts, honoring tribal sovereignty, pursuing approaches that create good paying union jobs and support healthy communities, honoring private property rights and supporting voluntary stewardship, including on working lands, using science as a guide and building on existing tools and strategies with an emphasis on flexibility and adaptive approaches. And I want to highlight the last one on existing tools and strategies, because one of the things we heard quite a bit in the outreach that was done before the report and many of the meetings I've attended since the report are the importance of supporting efforts that are working around the West, not just creating new shiny ideas, but supporting what we have in terms of tools we can use, programs that are working. And at the BLM, we do have a lot of tools, and we look forward to continuing to build on those. The other key list from the report is the 6 focus areas that would be early focus for implementing the principles. And again, they do overlap, creating more parks and safe outdoor opportunities in nature-deprived communities, supporting tribally led conservation and restoration priorities, expanding collaborative conservation of fish and wildlife habitat and corridors, increasing access for recreation, which on federal lands includes access to lands that are technically public lands, but are not accessible yet, incentivizing and rewarding voluntary conservation efforts, and creating good paying union jobs by investing in restoration and resilience. Obviously an opportunity to tie in here with the Civilian Climate Corps. In terms of the metrics and the next steps, there are a couple of those. One is creating an American Conservation and Stewardship Atlas to collect baseline information. And that effort is being led in part by an interagency working group that will start to define what conservation might look like and where we are as a baseline. And then we'll have annual updates on the progress we're making in support of those efforts. And those annual reports will start at the end of 2021. The interagency working group has started meeting and is meeting on a quarterly basis. And our next steps will be looking at projects and partnerships and ways to make this count on the ground. We did have a lot of outreach, as I mentioned before the report, and since the report, I've been doing a lot of meetings around the West. And there was a strong recommendation for a continuum of effective conservation measures, and also a repeated ask for how can we be involved in what the interagency working group does as they're developing these metrics and these ideas. And I think that's something we've heard and are looking into, how to make sure that there are parallel efforts to collect information and get input on standards and what might count along the way. And some projects are underway. The good news is we're not waiting to get all the next value rounds of reports and metrics done, because again, while the report does focus on the atlas and reporting, it also focuses on supporting this broader range of initiatives. So we have a wonderful mandate to start supporting a big range of projects, and we are doing that. We did announce a project in Wyoming in August when the Secretary of the Interior was here meeting with Governor Gordon, where the Department of the Interior and the Department of Agriculture would be supporting Wyoming's wildlife corridor strategy. And that obviously fits right in with expanding collaborative conservation of fish and wildlife habitat and corridors. We have a lot of opportunities there around the West, building on what we did, starting with Secretarial Order 3362 on big game corridors. And then we've seen really great efforts around the West. In Wyoming and Colorado, for example, we've seen executive orders issued by the governors to create their efforts to identify and manage big game corridors. And I think we see that as a great way to continue collaborating in support of this initiative. Next slide. So it's the BLM's 75th anniversary. In 1946, the General Land Office merged with the Grazing Service to create what is now the BLM. That may not sound like a movie script for a love story, but this administrative action set in motion really hard work by people on the ground who turn public policy into reality. Across the country, this creates a living anthology of our relationship with the public and public land. here at the BLM. As an example of some efforts we're also taking on to address our relationship with the public, we are addressing the upheaval that was caused by the relocation of numerous positions and the headquarters of the BLM. Right now, we've worked with the Interior Department leadership and career staff and many stakeholders, including tribes and elected officials, to understand the ramification of the headquarters move and determine the best way forward. So far, we've announced the return of the national headquarters to Washington, D.C., and confirmed that there will be a Western headquarters located in Grand Junction, Colorado, to provide an additional on-the-ground perspective and input, and taking this opportunity to come out with a more functional BLM. Given the impact of the previous relocation to our staff and the BLM's ability to be effective, it's really important that we are careful and do this right. So there will be more details, and we of course will always welcome input. And our goal is with this approach that people will have certainty both internally at the BLM and for all the external customers that we serve. Then our goal would be that we can then function in the best way possible to fill our responsibilities to the American people and to our employees, and keep moving forward to look forward for another 75 years and be the best BLM we can be. We know that public lands are important to so many people in this country for so many different reasons: recreation, conserving wildlife habitat, preserving the livelihood of so many communities. And our multiple use and sustained yield mandate will continue to evolve to meet the needs of the country as we go forward. And we look forward to working with many of you on that evolution, and urge you all to stay in the game with us. I'm sure there's a lot of more things we could discuss. So I think I'll stop talking and doing slides and take some questions.
Great, thanks, Neda. I'm going to take a bit of a moderator's privilege here and just note, because I forgot to note it earlier, and you triggered my memory by mentioning critical minerals, that we had hoped to include a panel on critical minerals at this conference, but just didn't have enough room. So we have rescheduled a discussion on critical minerals that will take place over a webinar format on November 15th from 12 to 1:30 p.m. And you can find information about that future panel on SER's website. So moderator privilege over, thank you. So I see we have a few questions in the chat, largely around renewable energy. And so just to remind the participants, if you'd like to ask a question, please utilize the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So I'll ask the first question I see here, which is, what interagency or whole government work is being done to support the renewable energy goals? In particular, how is the Forest Service being included in that effort with the BLM for wind and solar?
So one of the other tasks we were assigned in the Energy Act of 2020 was to coordinate with other agencies, and we're moving forward with a memorandum of understanding that would allow us to more efficiently coordinate both through the renewable energy coordination offices themselves, but also just generally with our sister agencies at Interior and also the Forest Service. So we're looking forward to being able to have identified staff to coordinate. And I think when we do some of these larger programmatic efforts, I expect we would include the Forest Service as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next question is a little complicated, so I am just going to read it because I think there's a lot in here to unpack. So it says the BLM's renewable energy program in Wyoming is not included in the wind and solar leasing rule. Permits are processed as right-of-way through field office realty programs under often outdated RMPs that are inadequate for considering large-scale renewable energy developments. Is the agency considering updating how renewables are developed here through inclusion of leasing programs and/or programmatic assessment of designated energy development zones?
That was a lot of questions. So I think in terms of the broader review I mentioned, where we just did the listening sessions of what would work best, is it best to use leasing, competitive leasing, rights of way, designated leasing areas, which are similar to priority areas. I think we're open to ideas there. And, as we're moving forward with land use planning in the state, we have that opportunity to look at it, but we certainly are open to the idea of considering other changes to address it better. We're looking at, again, what we can do in regulation, but also what we can do with some guidance in the interim, as we've recently done for some areas in California, where we can make it more attractive to develop on public lands, but also some of the issues that were addressed in these broader programmatic documents that Wyoming was not part of, as you noted, were, kind of the best areas to go. So we're looking at how we can take that into account going forward. It's on the table, and again, appreciate input and suggestions on that for sure.
Don't forget about us in Wyoming. Great, thanks.
Never.
All right, so the next question is another renewable interesting question. The commenter noted that it's interesting in the work you mentioned that the BLM was going to do with wind energy areas. What's the BLM thinking of to encourage more wind on BLM land? So this is similar to what you just answered, but what are the hurdles that need to be addressed to encouraging more renewables on BLM lands?
I think we've heard a lot of different things from regulators and states and stakeholders and industry. As always, there's the question of how long it takes us to permit and how do we prioritize areas and permits. So that's a lot of what we're looking for, is when we have state offices, district offices, field offices that have to process permits for all kinds of uses. How can we best prioritize time and places? So I think those are some of the hurdles we're looking at, and also doing the analysis where, as the previous commenter pointed out, we haven't done an upfront analysis at a programmatic level to screen an area for wind or solar. Those are some of the burdens if it's proposed, the project's proposed outside one of those zones. And then the last burden or hurdle I would note is transmission. We have zones that we had identified for wind or solar that might not have sufficient transmission capability anymore because they've been used, or new projects are won't be proposed in areas until they can be sure the transmission is going forward. So I think that's another hurdle, and that's why we're looking at transmission at the same time as we're looking at how we permit projects.
Great, thanks. I have a question I'm going to ask on behalf of a student who's doing a thesis on this topic of the SageGrouse RMPs. And so you mentioned the BLM is going back to relook at revising the SageGrouse RMPs west-wide. What's the process for engaging with the states and the communities going forward? Because it just feels like it's been a bit of a whipsaw, kind of back and forth with regards to the SageGrouse policy. So how can we move forward with a bit more stability in terms of what's happening on the ground for SageGrouse conservation?
So I'm not sure if the question is how are we going to move forward and loop everyone in with what we're doing, or
let's go the first part. That's the more interesting question.
Okay.
Yep.
And yes, hopefully that will also get us to the second part of this. But again, I think we're expecting to kick off scoping in the next month or so, and that will certainly be an opportunity for a more formal engagement with the public. We are expecting and hoping that we'll have a lot of cooperating agencies again from the states. The 2015 SageGrouse effort was really a model of everybody coming to the table. The Western Governors Association supported the effort with a specific task force. So we're really looking forward to working with all the governors again on this, because their input is really important. So there will be these formal scoping opportunity, but again, I think what we have learned is the more we can have conversations with people and get them to the table, the better we're going to get to the second part of that question, Temple, which is how do we make it stick and stop whipsawing? And I think that's where we're looking to focus this effort on implementation. What are the updates we might need to the plan to make to the plans to make it more efficient to implement the measures in the plans, get to conserving and restoring sage-grouse habitat while we're also continuing to permit other multiple uses. It's a big challenge, but we did manage to do that once before, so I think we can do it again. But again, trying to make this a narrower effort so that we can get to work on it, and would like to do that at the same time. So we're looking for thoughts, of course, but there are certainly opportunities for ongoing cooperation to keep that conversation live, and I think that's what we need to succeed here.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from somebody looking for some insider info. Any updates on the timeline for the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan?
It's a great question, and ask for insider info. And I'm sure we have BLM Wyoming folks watching this too. So I can tell you that we are interested in moving forward with it and look forward to doing that as soon as we can with all of you. We're taking a hard look at it, and it's a really exciting opportunity to address so many of the issues I just covered in that presentation. So we'll be looking at that.
Great. We have 1 minute left and one question left, although it's a bit of a tough question. So if we go a little bit over, that's okay. But asking about Orphan Wells, can you explain how the BLM goes through the chain of title for a lease to collect additional reclamation funding, and how BLM holds previous leaseholders accountable? So I know that's a doozy, but to the extent you can answer all or part of that, that'd be great.
Right. I'm not sure I'm the best person to give you the step-by-step on that, but that is certainly the reason they end up as Orphan Wells. A lot of the time is they don't become Orphan Wells till we've determined that there's nobody left on the hook. So I think that's really the issue here, and that may be different for idled wells in our efforts that we've recently been updating on. How do we keep wells from becoming idled and idled wells from becoming Orphan Wells? And certainly we do look at whatever bonds we might have and access those first. So it's probably a very unsatisfactory answer to a question that probably, if we sat down with our experts at BLM who do this, would be a 30-minute answer. So maybe a little plus and a little minus.
Sounds good. Appreciate the stab at that complicated question. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Deputy Director Culver. Really appreciate your insights and your presentation today.
Thanks for having me.